Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Tanner Steed, and today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite mediums, LIQUIN. When I first started oil painting, I used LIQUIN very early on. In fact, it was introduced to me by my uncle, Jeff Starr. I was a little afraid, especially because of the scent of it, because it has this really intense scent, and on the back it says, warning, combustible, harmful or fatal if swallowed, vapor harmful, skin irritant, contains petroleum distillate. So I was like, oh man, I don't know if I should be using this. There's also this like weird feeling of oil paint being this toxic medium that you really need to be careful of, which can be true if you don't know what you're using. If I started, using LIQUIN with cadmium paints and I got it all over my hands and I started eating a sandwich, that would be guaranteed cancer in my future. So this is nothing to be afraid of if you know how to use it. So that is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Wait, before we start the video, make sure to hit that like button down below and subscribe if you haven't done so already. We're coming out with videos weekly and I can't wait to show you more. I absolutely love LIQUIN. That's why I buy the big 500 ml. This is just LIQUIN Original. They make a couple different types. If you've never used LIQUIN before, I suggest that you start out with just the original. They make a thinner called LIQUIN Fine Detail. Essentially, they've made it so you can paint with them in different stages of your painting. They make another one called LIQUIN Impasto Medium, and it has just a different consistency to the actual medium itself. Under the description on the back, it says it reduces brushstroke retention and resists yellowing. It's a semi-gloss finish and not suitable as a varnish. You mix this into your paints and it gives not only a nice fluid viscosity to the paint, but it also creates this nice semi-gloss finish. I really like to use this specifically because in the dark areas of your painting, as you paint from day to day, if you're painting infrequently, those dark areas kind of sink in and become an inaccurate value or a different value compared to what you laid down with the fresh, wet brush stroke. It can almost look chalky and can create a sense of like an incorrect value, a little bit lighter than what you put down. So this semi-gloss adds a glossy nature to each brushstroke, and the darks will remain closer to that original intention when you put it down the first time. So when I first started using LIQUIN Original, I thought, okay, this is a medium, so I need to take my palette and I need to put my medium in one of my medium cups, right? That's what they're meant for, so that's how I should use it. This, although it's easy and very accessible to put it into these cups, this is actually an improper use of LIQUIN, and that's why I'm making this video. It's so important that you don't only do that. The best way to use LIQUIN is to actually pre-mix all of your paint with a relative even ratio of paint to LIQUIN, not 50-50, rather consistently putting roughly, 20% LIQUIN into all of your paints. And you're gonna find that each one of your paints, as you mature as an oil painter, or you may already know this, certain paints will have more oil or less oil, just depending on the actual pigment size. If you're looking at maybe a titanium white, it's going to be a very opaque pigment with not a ton of oil. The oil content also relates to drying time. Titanium white is like kind of a mid dry time, whereas let's say a cadmium yellow takes a really long time to dry. Ivory black has a lot of oil content to it, and you can tell right when you're squeezing out the paint onto the palette, it will actually drip with linseed oil. So if you were mixing LIQUIN into ivory black tends to have just a lot of extra oil to it, and that just has to do with the pigment size and the amount of oil a company can get away with putting into it. They can get away with putting a lot of oil because of the pigment strength. It's a very powerful dark pigment, and that's why they can just use a lot of filler and a lot of linseed oil. So when you're adding LIQUIN to a paint with a lot of extra oil, it may seem like you should add less. Really, the most important thing is that you do not go over 20 to 30% LIQUIN to your original paint. tube, no matter the pigment. And the reason for that is if you're being consistent in your painting process and mixing this general percentage, you are going to create layers of paint stacked on top of one another that are creating a stronger bond between the layers. And that's really what's important. If you were to, let's say, paint with a very thick, chunky, full impasto brushstrokes and then lay down really, really thin brushstrokes on top, very thinned out with Gamsol or turpentine, you're going to create a surface that has a lot of oil content in the thick brushstrokes, and those will take a really long time to dry, whereas that thin coat that you put on top is going to be really, really quick. By doing that, you're going to create a situation where your painting will crack. That's why people talk about fat over lean. So you want lean layers in the base layers and more fat content or more oil towards the later layers. Now, this becomes kind of confusing when you're using LIQUIN, and that's because LIQUIN is a fast dryer. So I think of this as not only a fast dryer, but it contains oil. So you should not be putting very thin layers of Gamsol, super diluted, washy pigment on top of your LIQUIN, even if your LIQUIN is touch dry. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take some of this LIQUIN, I'm gonna put it on my palette, and I'm just gonna show you a basic procedure that I do at the beginning of every painting session if I plan to use LIQUIN. I'll lay out all of my pigments, and then I'll pour just a little bit of this in the corner of my palette, and I'll show you kind of the viscosity of the LIQUIN itself, and then I'm going to add it to each one of my paints at a relative even ratio, pigment to LIQUIN. We're going to be mixing with just 2 pigments today. I'm going to be using this Williamsburg titanium white. It's one of my favorite whites of all time. We're just going to juxtapose that with the opposite. We're going to use ivory black. This is by Michael Harding. So as I open this LIQUIN and I begin to pour it out on my palette, I am reminded by its really intense aroma. And it reminds me to tell you that it is so important to have great ventilation in your studio. If you don't have a window with a fan or a very large space to be working in, this is not a material that you should be inhaling on a day-to-day basis. And that goes along with Gamsol and mineral spirits. Mineral spirits and Gamsol are equally as toxic, and perhaps I don't know the exact LD50 for these things, but both of them are toxic to you. So you should try to limit your exposure as much as possible, or paint in a very well ventilated area. This is a really interesting substance. It's so oily, but it also kind of has a chunk to it. So I think they refer to this as thixotropic. Correct me in the comments if you know the actual word. I could be getting it right. But essentially it's a gel until you start manipulating it. So when you move it around, it kind of evens out and creates a very soft and seamless surface. And it doesn't retain brush strokes quite as well. And I think that's why LIQUIN came out with LIQUIN Impasto Gel. Now the fine detail is even more liquidy than this, and that's because it has more oil content in it than this does. This titanium white is such a nice consistency on its own. I love to paint with no mediums, but sometimes I do need the rate of my paint to dry quicker. Rather than scooping up this whole thing and adding it to it, I'm just going to add a very minute amount. Now, there it is on my palette knife next to my paint. I'm going for a ratio that's about 20%. Okay, and I know people glaze with this, but when you glaze with LIQUIN, you have to be careful that not going over that ratio too much too often, because it can lead to yellowing. Now, my paint is definitely a lot softer and more fluid. It's taking on that gel-like consistency. And that was just using about 20 to 30% liquid, and it already has this really nice texture to it. Now, what's great about liquid is I could paint with this, and by tomorrow, just 24 hours minimum, if it's a very thin brushstroke, it will be dry to the touch. But if it's a thick brushstroke, it's going to have a tacky consistency, and that can create some really interesting effects. So you'll just have to experiment with that. Even with that minute amount, it's still quite runny, and I haven't added any Gamsol to this to thin it whatsoever. This can be extremely helpful if you're trying to glaze at a rapid rate. In order to glaze properly, your paint needs to be completely dry underneath. In order to glaze, the paint layer underneath needs to be completely dry before you put a transparent layer on top. Now, liquid can be so great if you wanted to glaze, because you could paint a la prima, super opaque the first day using liquid, and by the day, just one day later, your paint layers will be completely dry and sealed, so you can paint transparently on top using either liquid fine detail or a variety of other mediums. But the important part is that you are aware of its drying time, and you never want anything to dry faster on the later layers compared to the earlier layers. You have to think about fat over lean and the drying time to prevent cracking. And that's just to prevent cracking and to prevent something called delamination. Delamination is the process of paint literally peeling off of the surface if you're painting in layers. So perhaps you've painted one layer with just the natural nature of the pigment as it came out of the tube, and then you've painted with liquid on top of that. Well, the liquid on top will dry too fast compared to the out of the tube paint layer, and the paint on top will become more brittle. Therefore, it will lead to it cracking and then eventually peeling off in flakes. And I've heard horror stories by artists from beginners to masters where this has happened. So it really is quite important to think about. All right, now I'm going to squeeze out some ivory black, and certain ivory blacks will be more oily than others. I've actually found that Michael Harding is less oily, which tells me that they aren't overusing linseed oil because they can get away with it. So notice how it isn't dripping, and there isn't much of an oily residue. If I had my ivory black by Winsor & Newton, I'd squeeze it out, but what would happen was I would squeeze it out and then it would immediately start dripping oil out of it. And you can just tell that they have just packed that thing full of oil and hardly any pigment. And so this is actually an argument for purchasing a more expensive paint. This is significantly more expensive than Winsor & Newton or Gamblin or, you know, some of the other paints. But you may actually be getting more out of this tube of the exact same size compared to the other grade paints. And I'm not knocking them because I use Winsor & Newton all the time. I love that paint. The important thing is that you take your liquid at that ratio of no more than 20-30%, and when you're mixing it, do not just mix half of it. You need to mix the entire quantity of paint. It needs to be mixed thoroughly, and that way there aren't bubbles or patches full of paint that will be drying at a completely different time. I really make sure to mix it up and just go through it, sometimes going a little bit overboard, and it's just a really good practice to start out now. And yes, it's kind of time consuming early on, but I assure you it's worth all of this early preparation, especially even if you're using 10 pigments. It's important to do this because you're not going to have cracking and your paint is going to be dry tomorrow and ready to glaze. So I have a ton of extra liquid. I have a couple options. I could scrape this off and throw it away. Or if it is not contaminated by any of these pigments, I will clean off my palette knife and just stick it right back into the liquid original tube. It's really important to stay clean when working with oil paints and stay organized. So that is just one example of a good way to save your liquid if it does come out too quickly. Now, if you paint with too much liquid and you mix too much and over that ratio, you're going to create a surface that is entirely too glossy and almost unable to be viewed from certain areas because of its glare. So if you're trying to not get that over glossy look and you still want more of a matte finish, make sure not to use too much Liquin. It's hard to go back once you've used too much. So although mediums and Liquin in particular can be kind of a scary subject for some, especially for beginners, I hope this guide gave you a couple quick tips to be able to jump in and start using Liquin. Essentially, just make sure that you are mixing all of your paint up with Liquin before you begin a painting session. There are many other applications for Liquin that I did not talk about in this video, but I definitely plan to address them in future videos. If there's a question that you desperately need answered, please just comment down below and I'll do my best to answer it, and or if I don't know, point you in the right direction. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed already, go for it. Smash that like button. It's really helping us out. We are growing together and I can't believe all your comments that you guys are leaving. I really appreciate them. It's just great to hear from you guys. It's really cool. Thanks again.